By the most basic logic of evolution, this shouldn't exist. An organism's entire biological project is to pass on as many of its genes as it can for as long as its body is capable of doing it. That's the rule almost every species on Earth follows without exception. An elephant keeps reproducing into her 60s. A baleen whale keeps reproducing into her 90s, sometimes longer. Reproduction for almost every living thing only stops when life itself stops. So somewhere, in a small handful of species, something happened that shouldn't have been allowed to happen at all. A female's body kept living, kept functioning, kept using energy and resources to stay alive, and then years or even decades before her life actually ended, her reproductive system simply shut down. Not because she was dying, not because she was too weak to continue. She stopped while there was still a third, sometimes a half of her life left to live. If you tried to explain that to natural selection in its own terms, it sounds like a mistake. It sounds like giving something up for nothing. And yet here you are, and here this trait still is. So somewhere in that apparent mistake, there has to be a real evolutionary logic holding it together. That's what we're actually going to trace today. Not just what menopause is, but why a trait that looks like it breaks evolution's most basic rule has survived, unbroken, for a very long time. Start with how strange this actually is, biologically. Menopause is not getting older. Every animal experiences reproductive decline as it ages. Eggs become less viable, hormone levels shift, fertility drops. That part is universal and unremarkable. What's not universal, what's actually rare almost to the point of non-existence, is a hard stop. A point at which reproduction ends completely, while the rest of the body, brain, muscles, organs, immune system, keeps functioning at full capacity for years afterward. Outside of humans, researchers have confirmed a statistically significant post-reproductive lifespan in exactly 4 other species, and all 4 of them are whales. Killer whales, short-finned pilot whales, narwhals, and beluga whales. That's it. Out of the roughly 6,000 species of mammals alive today, 5 are confirmed to do this. 5. Everything else, every primate, every big cat, every hoofed animal, every rodent, just keeps going reproductively until the body itself gives out. The killer whale case is the best documented, so it's worth sitting with the actual numbers. Resident killer whale females typically stop reproducing by around age 40, but they don't die at 40. They keep living, in many cases, into their 80s or 90s, the same order of lifespan as a human grandmother. Short-finned pilot whales show the same pattern on a slightly different timescale. Reproduction stops by around age 36, but individuals have been tracked living past 65. In both species, that means an animal spends anywhere from a third to more than half of her total adult life in a state no other mammal experiences, fully alive, fully capable in every other respect, and permanently finished reproducing. So the real question isn't why do bodies age? It's why would evolution deliberately install an early shutdown switch in exactly 5 species, when every other mammal on the planet does perfectly fine reproducing until the end? And for a long time, the leading answer to that question was, honestly, a bit of a shrug. The oldest explanation, sometimes called the artifact hypothesis, argued that menopause wasn't really an adaptation at all. It was just a side effect of ovaries running out of a finite, fixed supply of egg cells sooner than the rest of the body wears out. Under this view, women in the deep past rarely lived long enough to experience menopause in any meaningful way. It only became visible as a widespread phenomenon once modern medicine and nutrition started extending human lifespans, well past what our reproductive systems were built to last. It's a tidy explanation, and for humans alone, it was hard to fully rule out. But it has one serious problem. It cannot explain the whales. A killer whale's ovaries aren't failing because modern veterinary care let her live unnaturally long. Killer whales in the wild, with no human intervention at all, still show this same post-reproductive lifespan. If menopause were just bodies outliving their reproductive shelf life by accident, we would not expect to see the same very specific pattern independently show up in an ocean-dwelling mammal that split from the human lineage roughly 90 million years ago. When two completely unrelated branches of the mammal family tree land on the same unusual trait, biologists stop looking for an accident and start looking for a shared underlying pressure. That search produced two serious competing explanations, and the honest answer is that neither one alone tells the whole story. The first is what's known as the grandmother hypothesis, developed most prominently by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes through decades of fieldwork with the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer population in Tanzania. Hawkes noticed something that didn't fit a simple story of women just retiring from reproduction. Older, post-reproductive women in these communities weren't idle. They were often the most productive food gatherers in the entire group, spending long hours digging tubers and collecting food, and then handing a significant share of it directly to their daughters' children. The math behind this is genuinely elegant once you follow it through. In evolutionary terms, what matters isn't how many children you personally have, it's how many of your genes make it into the next generation by any route available. A woman who stops having her own children, but instead spends those years keeping her existing grandchildren alive and well-fed, can, under the right conditions, pass on more of her genetic legacy than she would by continuing to have a few more children of her own, especially since childbirth becomes progressively riskier with age. Hawkes' calculation is blunt but persuasive. It only pays off, in strict Darwinian terms, if a woman can expect to help raise roughly twice as many grandchildren through that support as she would have raised additional children herself. That threshold is exactly the kind of trade-off that could push a species toward favoring an early reproductive stop, if the circumstances line up. The second explanation goes by a less flattering name, the reproductive conflict hypothesis, developed largely through the research of Michael Kant and colleagues, and tested directly using decades of killer whale field data gathered by groups including the Center for Whale Research. This explanation doesn't ask why an older female would want to stop reproducing. It asks why she'd benefit from stopping, specifically once her daughter starts reproducing alongside her, in the same group at the same time. In killer whale society, and in many traditional human societies, there's a specific and consistent pattern. Daughters tend to stay within their birth group for life, while sons leave to mate with females from other groups. Over enough generations, this creates a very particular kind of relatedness math within the group. An older female, surrounded increasingly by her own daughters, granddaughters, and their offspring, becomes more genetically connected to the group's next generation through her descendants than through any additional child she might have herself. Meanwhile, if she keeps competing reproductively with her own daughter for the same limited resources, food, safety, attention, in whale societies, even calf survival rates tied to a mother's social rank, that competition actively works against her own genetic interests, because it risks harming offspring she's already more related to than to a hypothetical new calf of her own. Stepping back from reproduction, in this light, isn't sacrifice. It's the mathematically better bet. For years, these two ideas were treated as competing answers, each trying to be the single correct explanation. But a large 2024 study analyzing lifespan and reproductive data across 32 species of toothed whales changed the shape of that argument. The research team, which included Sam Ellis, Darren Croft, and collaborators working with long-term killer whale population records, found that menopause had evolved independently at least 5 separate times across the whale family tree. Not once and then inherited, but repeatedly, from scratch, in different lineages facing similar social structures. And in every one of those independent cases, the same underlying condition was present: daughters staying local, sons dispersing, and multiple generations of females overlapping and reproducing in the same tight-knit group at the same time. That detail matters enormously because it means the two competing explanations weren't actually rivals. They were two halves of the same mechanism. The reproductive conflict hypothesis explains the trigger. Why, specifically, an older female in this exact social arrangement benefits from stepping back rather than continuing to compete. The grandmother hypothesis explains what she does with the decades of life that follow, turning years that could have gone toward a few more risky pregnancies into consistent, compounding support for children and grandchildren who already carry her genes. Selection didn't have to choose between stop competing and start helping. Once the first became advantageous, the second became almost inevitable. Because a long-lived, capable female, with no more of her own offspring to raise, had every incentive, genetically, to redirect that capability toward the family she already had. This is also, probably, why menopause never evolved in most other mammals, even highly social, long-lived ones like elephants. Elephant society is matriarchal and cooperative, and elephant grandmothers absolutely help raise calves. But critically, in most elephant populations, it's the daughters who eventually disperse to new herds, while other patterns of relatedness form. So the very specific overlapping generations and competition setup that makes early reproductive shutdown mathematically favorable in killer whales and humans doesn't line up the same way. The trait isn't unavailable to evolution in general. It requires a fairly narrow, specific set of social conditions to actually pay off. And outside of humans, apparently only a few whale lineages have consistently met them. Which brings this back to the deceptively simple assumption at the very start, that menopause looks like evolution failing to finish its job, cutting off reproduction while a body still has decades of life left in it. Run the math on relatedness, social structure, and risk the way Hawks, Kant, Ellis, and the researchers building on their work have, and the opposite is true. It isn't a shutdown, it's a redirection, and a remarkably precise one. A trait so demanding to evolve, so dependent on a very specific set of social conditions being met, that in the entire history of mammalian life, it appears to have only been worth it a handful of times. Every one of those times, the same basic trait held. A long, still capable life spent investing in family you're already related to beats a shorter window spent trying to have a little more of your own. If menopause is part of your own biology, or someone's you know, it's tempting culturally to talk about it only as an ending, the close of one chapter of a body's story. The evolutionary record makes a different and, frankly, more interesting argument. It isn't decline. It's one of the rarest, most selectively demanding traits documented in the entire mammal kingdom, shared with a small number of the ocean's most socially complex animals. And it exists for exactly one reason. Because a life spent helping the family you already have, it turns out, can outperform a life spent only trying to add to it. That's not evolution running out of a plan partway through. That's evolution finishing the plan in a way almost nothing else alive ever gets selected to do. That's the actual mechanism behind something most people have only ever heard described as an ending, not a strategy. If you want the next place real research quietly overturns the assumed story, that's exactly what this channel exists to keep finding. Subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you the version backed by the evidence, not the version everyone already assumes.